It was Chas Hardern, owner of the fine old original longboat Chiltern, who was going to be my guide to the delights of the Llangollen Canal. This starts its journey to Wales way out on the rich Cheshire Plain. At Hurlstone Locks, the Llangollen leaves the main Shropshire Canal, the Shroppy to all canal experts. And problem number one, how are we going to get into the canal at all?
You can see why I was worried. You couldn't drop a cigarette paper on either side of this narrowboat. And the big test is this. This is the narrowest lock in the whole canal. And if you get through this, well, you'll get through any one of them. And so our voyage towards the beauties of the Valley of the Dee is definitely on.
And straight away, as we ascended the water stairway of lock after lock, I felt I was being carried back to the early days of engineering in this country. For the canals were the first civil engineering works on a big scale constructed in Britain. As we began our journey, I saluted the names of the pioneers who built it, William Jessop, and one of the most famous of them all, Thomas Telford. They began the Llangollen Canal in 1798. Before the railways, it made good money on coal from the North Wales coalfield. And even when the days of final eclipse arrived after the First World War, the Llangollen Canal stayed open, for it had one final asset. Here, near Nantwich, the waters of the River Dee are collected from the canal into Hurlstone Reservoir, and the good folk of Cheshire drink the waters from the Welsh hills, carefully filtered and purified, of course. So out from the locks, onto the long, slow journey through the rich Cheshire Plain, with Chas, Dave and Judy the dog. All the old narrowboats had a dog. And our narrowboat Chiltern is one of the few left unchanged, with all the traditional decorations, castles and roses, china plates, oil lamps and coal-burning stoves, brass bed knobs. This was how the old boatman families lived aboard. The men who owned their own boats, the number ones they called themselves proudly. They lived, they were born, and christened on the canals. They never left them. Willymore Lock, with a real canal pub. It owes its very existence to the canal. You can't reach it from the road. Here you're back into the world of the old boatmen, with their special dress, their elaborate belts into which they stuck their own personal windlasses for working the lock gates. And note, they were always boatmen, never bargees. And their narrow boats, painted with pride, with castles and roses, well, they could never be mistaken for barges. These canal pubs were almost the only places where the floating population could meet socially, and they exchanged all the gossip of the cut, as they called the canal. And Mrs. Pam Wood was born here, at the lock at Willymore, and her father remembers it all. And there's still no road except 4 fields across which they bring the beer in. On under canal bridge after canal bridge, and how simple and architecturally satisfying they are. A graceful arch amongst green meadows. This is bridge number 26. They're all numbered, and there are plenty of them. You reach bridge 50 before you come to the end of the Llangollen Canal. Oh, the gentle pleasure, drifting through the drowsing country to the chug-chug lullaby of the diesel engine. This sound, however, came late to the canals. Before about 1900, you'd have heard the clip-clop of horses' hooves along the towpath. We're coming to Grindley Brook, a staircase lock, where you've got to know what you're doing when you use your windlass. Going down, you can overfill the bottom lock, flood the path, and you'll be laughed at by what the old boatmen called the gongoozlers. The onlookers ready to chuckle at other people's mistakes. Our experts took us through perfectly. All the paddles opened and closed in the right order. But it's a tight squeeze. Our narrowboat Chiltern just fitted the lock, but you couldn't spare another 6 inches. The architecture of the canal delighted me. Llangollen was constructed during a good period, the Regency. The lock keepers' houses have an attractive elegance. Now, a surprise. For a mile or so, the canal crosses the border and puts its toe into Wales at Wynford. This is the attractive part of the old county of Flint that they called Welsh Mylor. Wynford's a real moss, a relic of the Ice Age. Here's a vast area studded with trees, and they're still cutting peat at Wynford. The canal drives straight through the peat cutting, and away in the distance you get your first glimpse of the Welsh hills. At this point, we are well into that surprising country they call the Cheshire Lakeland. The canal runs between a whole series of little hills and lakes or meres, alive with ducks and rare insects. Again, this country is a legacy of the Ice Age. The melting glaciers left hollows and moraines, behind which there are now secluded beauty spots. And the canal is the best way to see them. The canal skirts the lakes and then goes into a short tunnel. We'll be meeting other tunnels later on, much longer ones. Ellesmere Tunnel is only 87 yards. But we've got to remember what a substantial step forward these canal tunnels represented. No one had built tunnels on this scale before. Totally new engineering problems had to be faced. For the men of the Regency period, the canal tunnels were a staggering sensation. It was incredible. You could actually float through a mountain. Welsh Frankton. This is the quiet, rather overgrown basin where the Montgomery Canal joins the Llangollen. It's a reminder of the once busy network of canals that were the lifeline of Britain's commerce during the Industrial Revolution. It's strange to see what was the most important part of our industrial structure for over 60 years, now slowly choking with reeds. Parts are neglected, parts are still open. The dream is that eventually we'll have the whole of the old Montgomery back to life like the Llangollen. The Welsh border is near, and it's marked not by the usual Croeso I Gymru, but by a sign on the bank demanding in determined tones, who the hell was Mad Jack Mitten? Well, I can tell you that he was the prototype of the wild Regency buck living in Mitten Hall on the border, the only man who claimed he could leap the canal on horseback. He was a mad steeplechaser, didn't mind how many bones he broke. And he rode a bear for a bet from the local circus into his dining room. But he also set fire to his nightdress, and so Mad Jack Mitten came to a lurid end. For us also, the canal becomes more lurid, more mitten-like. At last, near Chirk, we are crossing the Welsh border. At points almost alongside the canal runs Offa's Dyke, that remarkable earthwork thrown up in the 8th century to separate England from Wales. And the Welsh still talk about the adventure and the risk of going dros clawdd Offa, going to England, in other words. But the canal crossed the border alongside the railway in a remarkable aqueduct. The aqueduct and the viaduct make a splendid architectural composition. The aqueduct is Telford's, the viaduct is George Stephenson's. Two great engineers working on the same problem, both solving it with splendour and beauty, although Telford did it 50 years earlier. The canal aqueduct was a sensational feat for the day. The canal floats 70 feet above the racing river Ceiriog. And Telford solved the problem of keeping the water in by using an iron trough. Now, that caused a great deal of eyebrow lifting by the nervous shareholders of the day. Now you look from the canal through the solid Roman-like arches of the railway viaduct to the green hills of the Ceiriog Valley, almost as through the end of a telescope. The old boatman made light work of the crossing, but I felt a slight unease, floating in air, on water, as it were.
Well, I couldn't resist slipping off the boat and strolling the last section of the aqueduct to re-enter Wales. And I use the word re-enter advisedly because, as you know, we did put our toe into Wales at Wicksall Moss, but that place is so dead flat that most people who use the canal simply don't believe they've been in Wales at all. From now on, they're going to have no difficulty. Here begin the deep wooded valleys, the romantic castles, and the mountains that come right down to the canal's edge. And here too start the great engineering feats of the canal, the marvellous aqueducts and the long tunnels. And now I'm going to let Chaz and Dave, and not forgetting Judy the dog, take you through one of the most impressive of them all, Chirk Tunnel, over 450 yards long.
The intriguing thing about the tunnel was Telford's method of construction. He cut out sections of it first in deep trenches. Then he built the arch and filled in the trenches over it as he proceeded. This accounts for the fine detail of the brickwork and the towpath alongside. Many of the early canal tunnels were driven direct, with no towpath, and the boatmen had to lie on a plank on their backs and what they called leg the boat through. Nowadays, the pleasure boats switch on their lights and simply honk their way along. Out you come into the sunlight and a rich smell of cocoa from a nearby chocolate factory, and also into history. For from the canal you could look to the west, and there, perched on its hill, is Chirk Castle. Chirk is still lived in by the Middletons, whose most famous Tudor ancestor, Sir Hugh Middleton, made his fortune by cutting the New River, which brought a stream of fresh water into London for the first time. But Chirk Castle, in origin, dates far earlier than the Tudors. It was part of that iron ring of castles, built under Edward I, after he had overthrown Llywelyn, the last native prince of Wales. The canal has now become a general-purpose pleasure waterway. Everything goes on from canoeing to fishing. There's a tunnel, 191 yards long. The Llangollen Canal promoters weren't afraid to spend their money to make sure of getting the D water into their canal. And again, it's an eerie experience going through it, and some people even walk around over the top.
We're safely through the last tunnel of the canal. And now we've entered the Valley of the Dee. And we'll go sailing, as it were, over the high trench formed by the river. And ahead of us, there'll just be one intriguing lift bridge. And then we'll be approaching the masterpiece of Telford, the Pont Casiste Aqueduct. Yes, there's the
Last bridge on the canal.
Now then.
Oh, you want to stand here, Wynford?
Yes.
And throw it over that beam there, and
I
then
think I can
pull
do
it down.
Easier said than done, but here goes.
That's it. Spot
Perfect.
on. Right, come on,
Now
let's
then.
see it move. All your weight on that rope.
Right, give it.
Right, now come on, heave. Ah, that's it.
So to the greatest sensation of the canal. Canal enthusiasts claim there's nothing like it in the whole canal system. The great Pontcysyllte Aqueduct, which carries the canal across the valley of the Dee on 19 stone piers crowned with arches that lift the canal 120 feet above the river. Once we were embarked in it, I soon discovered why the Pontcysyllte Aqueduct was not only a sensation when they opened it, but has kept this reputation today.
There you go, dude.
Oh my goodness me, it's like floating up into the air. What? I've never seen this in the sky before. I don't like it.
As in the Chirk Aqueduct, the waters are carried in an iron trough, a new idea at the end of the 18th century. But then Telford was a bold original thinker, so bold that he decided that one side of the trough needed no protection at all. It made me shudder. And I wonder what they thought of it at the opening of the aqueduct in 1805, 1 month after Trafalgar. Those boatloads of nobility and gentry, all followed by the band of the Shropshire Volunteers, blowing away madly at patriotic airs. I bet they kept their eyes on the music. They'd have all gone out of tune if they'd looked dizzily down over that open side of the trough. Then came the salvos of joyous gunfire from 2 brass cannon captured from Tipu Sahib at Seringatapam. Ah, the ceremonial glories of industry 170 years ago. Boating through the air, a strange experience to float over the treetops and the river. But by this daring move, Telford had got his canal safely over to the east side of the Dee. I had a sigh of relief as we came over the crossing. I could enjoy once again those elegant little details of Regency curved rails. They seemed incapable of ugliness in those days, even when they were building utilitarian canals. At the end of the aqueduct, you enter the Trevor Basin, and here Chiltern faced a problem. A right-angled turn into the feeder, with only a depth of 18 inches of water guaranteed. Getting Chiltern in was like threading a 70-foot-long needle. Inevitably, we stuck. But we heaved a few paving stones of our ballast overboard, and we knew that now we'd be safely through to Llangollen. These last 5 miles up to Llangollen make a superb finale to the voyage. Does any canal take its rise in such beautiful country? First you sail through deep woods, then suddenly above you, the 1,000-foot-high hill of Dinas Bran, crowned with its ruined castle, and Bran in Welsh means a crow, though no man in Llangollen would ever insult this romantic ruin by calling it Crow's Castle. For Dinas Bran was a true Welsh castle, built by the princes of Powys. From the top you can look away to the east and see the canal entering the high Welsh hills from the flat Cheshire plain. Dinas Bran dramatically marks the point where Welsh Wales begins. Llangollen itself. This is the end of navigation. Here, near the Canal Museum, is the little basin called technically the winding hole, where the narrowboats have to turn. And I looked down and I saluted another band of devotees. They're like the canal lovers, the railway enthusiasts, who are restoring steam to Llangollen, giving the town back its railway to partner the canal. Two more last delights. Half a mile from the canal, mirrored in the pool where the monks kept their fish for Friday, Valle Crucis Abbey, the Abbey of the Valley of the Cross. Valle Crucis was a Cistercian foundation, and these hard-working, simple-living monks, well, they'd have approved of industrious Thomas Telford and his canal. Behind the abbey, towards the Horseshoe Pass, the mysterious Pillar of Ellesmere, dating back to the 9th century. I'm sure Prince Ellesmere, Prince of Powys, well, he'd have rubbed his eyes with astonishment if he'd seen the canal. 1,000 years separate him from Thomas Telford and all his works. And this is probably the most delightful of all his works. The spot where Telford flung a low dam across the swift Welsh waters of the Dee to start them on their long journey, to end eventually at Ellesmere Port on the Mersey. And the right time to voyage up the canal? Well, I think it's the beginning of July, when the little town holds the international Eisteddfod, and all the world's folk singers and dancers crowd Llangollen. The canal runs right alongside the Eisteddfod grounds, and it actually plays a modest part in the festival, for it's become a tradition among some choirs that, clad in their national costume, they should take a trip in one of the horse-drawn boats that have been there ever since the 1890s. So ends the slow, happy voyage up the 48 winding miles of the Llangollen Canal, with singing on the waters of the quietest of all the ways that lead to Wales.